Welcome to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I am Tammi Mack. Happy New Year, everyone. Let's get this thing kicked off right and going in the right direction. How about that? For the last 20 years, students, teachers, and parents have lived with the harsh reality that a school shooting can happen anywhere. Yeah, anywhere. In 2021 alone, there were 34 shootings, and 24 of them happened that fall. Gun violence and school shootings have sparked debates in policy and legislation concerning the role of teachers carrying firearms to ensure safety in schools. But is there a racial component when it comes to this issue? And what would this mean for Black students? Well, the business of being Black today are safer schools and arming teachers. Please welcome political activist and the founder of the Black Guns Matter, Maj Toure. Hi, Maj.
Hey, what's going on, Tammi? Appreciate you for having me.
Thank you. The Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives for Camden, New Jersey School District, Rand Miller. Hi, Rand.
Hey, Tammi. Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me.
The President of the Black Americans National Gun Club, Marcel Pope, is here. Hi, Marcel.
Hey, Tammi. Thanks for having me.
And pastor and the director of the Live Free campaign, Pastor Mike McBride. Let me start this party off with the question that I ask each and every day when we do this show is, why should Black people care? Why should Black people care if teachers are armed with guns in schools? Maj, take it away.
We should care because of the fact that historically we have a very rich tradition with firearms and firearms ownership. On top of that, if we, our children being the most important thing to our future, our legacy, our generational wealth, and all of these different things, we should give them the same respect of being protected from weirdos that we give our money, that we give entertainers at clubs, that we give our politicians. They are people walking around arming those, valuables, and our children being very valuable. Having someone that's a safe and responsible firearm owner to protect them in the absolute need and as a last resort, I think it's very important. And I think we've got to start looking at our children through that lens. If we're protecting other valuables that way, because guns are an effective tool or as a deterrent or a self-defensive tool, we got to view our children and give them that same level of life respect.
Pastor Mike, why should Black people care?
Well, I think Black people should care about this issue because we indeed have a culture of violence and death in this country that disproportionately visits Black folks, Black individuals and families. And at the same time, the schools, churches, public spaces are often policed by, or the security that is being extended to these spaces are done by people who do not hold the same regard for Black folks' lives, are culturally incompetent, and are often driven to violence as a way to try to secure some form of public safety. So I think we ought to be very careful about making a already very precarious space naturally for our loved ones much more lethal by introducing weapons that are not being used responsibly already, much less putting them in spaces where our children need to have a safe and healthy environment.
Rand.
Black people should care because Black children in schools in this country are overly suspended. They're disproportionately suspended, disproportionately expelled, and disproportionately referred to law enforcement. Black people should care because we see the videos that are shown all over the internet. We see videos where police officers are harming Black children, and we see issues where teachers cannot deal with the students that they have for the same reason that the pastor mentioned. They don't have the same care for our children. 80% roughly of the teachers in this country are white. Even with the change in demographics of our student populations, the majority of teachers, administrators in both private, public, as well as charter schools are predominantly white. And so to arm those teachers would be devastating for Black students because everyone's not going to be trained about having guns. Everyone's not going to be prepared to use them wisely. And so Black people should be monitoring this situation absolutely, because we don't want any more violence, any more tragedies to happen to Black students that they've already experienced.
Marcel, why should Black people care that teachers be armed in schools?
Well, Black people should care because we've seen that terrorist acts against us can happen anywhere at any time. And we need to protect our most valuable source, which is our children. The most innocent among us who can't defend themselves. Somebody has to step in and take that lead, make sure our children are safe.
So let's find out how you really feel about this. Should teachers be armed with guns, Marcel?
I believe they should, but I believe that there's a level of training that needs to come along with that as well, along with other measures that are in place to deter active shooters from seeing schools as soft targets.
Something doesn't sit right with me with teachers having guns, merely because teachers are probably the lowest paid on the totem pole and what they have to go through every day. I don't think that our government really understands what goes on in the mind of teachers when it comes to those students that they can't even discipline. Now you want them to have guns in their hands? I'm a little scared of that one, but Pastor Mike, speak on it.
Yeah, absolutely not. Teachers should not have guns. But teachers not having guns does not mean we can't protect our children. There are so many ways that we could introduce unarmed individuals, particularly trained African-American men and women who understand how to de-escalate and provide safety and intervene in fights and conflicts. I used to do it. I worked at a continuation school for many years. Folks brought guns and knives to school. I never had to use a gun or a knife to disarm a child in the school who was having an incident, getting with their emotions getting away from them. Putting guns in the hands of teachers in this climate is, to me, putting our children in harm's way. It's like opening the chicken coop and letting the wolves run in. Absolutely not. Teachers should not have guns with our most precious children in their classrooms.
I don't know about that de-escalation, Pastor. Even our police can't de-escalate. So I'm not sure that you put somebody in there like, who has absolutely no experience with that, if that would matter. Maybe a gun is necessary, Maj.
So the question here, one is also, I think we're getting caught in this, like, if teachers have a gun, then somehow because they're disproportionately white and female teachers, that somehow that means they're going to shoot our children. If you actually think that way about the school or your teachers that are at your school, why are you sending your child there in the first place? So that's a contradiction in the first place, right then and there. My experience with our, wonderful educators that are mostly hamstringed by, school curriculums and, the school board and things like that. The actual person that takes on the job of wanting to protect the children and educate the children care a lot for our children generally. Now, again, there's room for, fringes on either side. But my point in saying that is we send our children there. We can on one hand say, oh, this person, if they had access to a firearm, they would do something negative or whatever, and then say, I'm still going to send my child there. On top of that, another thing that's not been discussed here is we're not talking about teachers using a firearm on students. We're talking about people that come into our, into schools with the intent of harming people. The reason why those teachers are educators is because they care about our children. So with that being the case, giving them tools as a last resort, there's an organization called Faster Saves Lives in Ohio, where it's completely nonprofit. The teachers train, the teachers learn, they got law enforcement involved, so forth and so on. The teachers choose if they want to exercise their fundamental constitutional right to defend life, especially if need be for children. They train and they overwhelmingly agree to this program. So we got to remember, we're not talking about teachers shooting students. We're talking about teachers protecting students, if need be, from actual people that have no attachment to our children. Those are two different conversations.
But the data does not bear itself out, right? That the number of incidents of these shootings in schools require this level of arming every single teacher or even a population of teachers. School shootings are tragic.
What data is that?
Tragic. It's data from the Department of Justice. It's data from
saying what? What is the actual? What's the actual numbers?
Less than 2% of all shootings in this country happen in schools.
It's less than 1%.
Well, that's less than 2%. But
if it's less than 1%, I don't care if it's one of our children. I would love for someone to be there armed, responsibly trained to protect their life. So when you say data,
there's a lot of data in the gun prevention space that many of us are privy to. That also say that the more presence you have of firearms in any setting, the more likely those firearms are going to be used for accidental shootings, for accidental discharges that actually outnumber the kinds of incidents that are being used for self-defense. And so I think we have to be much more circumspect and intentional about making sure we have proportional responses to felt needs and real issues. Sometimes I believe that we as a people are attempting to solve problems that are sometimes unique and common to our folks by using the strategies of the very systems and culture that are deaf to our people generally. Nowhere in the world do you find these conversations about adding guns to schools to make schools more safe happening, except in the most violent country in the world, the United States of America. Black people ought to resist this narrative and think of different ways to keep our children and our people safe. And there are public health strategies to do so.
What's the public health strategy when a mass shooter comes in?
We'll be right back on the business of being Black with Tammi Mack. The business of being Black today are safer schools and arming teachers. Please welcome political activist and the founder of Black Guns Matter, Maj Toure, the director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives for Camden, New Jersey School District, Rand Miller, the president of the Black Americans National Gun Club, Marcel Pope, and pastor and the director of the Live Free campaign, Pastor Mike McBride. I'm Tammi Mack. Let's get with this. Maj, you were getting ready to chime in after Pastor Mike made his statement about guns in the schools, not the only answer to protect our kids.
Yeah, so I hear all of these concepts, but the reality is when there's a weirdo, a psychopath with a firearm, the reason why you call law enforcement is because there's a guy with a firearm to come neutralize that potential threat. We can't on one hand say, well, these shootings only make a small percentage, so we can't address it the same way. We also can't say it's a small percentage, but then say this is a serious issue. The reality is it is a serious issue. I don't care if it's only one child per year. That's one child too much. With that being the case, we need to have the most effective means to neutralize shooters. And there is no nonviolent approach to a murderer. There is not. And that's just the unfortunate reality. And again, going back to like organizations like Faster Save Lives, these are very local. This isn't a one size fit all scenario. You know, the issues that you have in New York, you obviously don't have in, a rural America. But the thing is, giving teachers that option, if they want to exercise their right and train to potentially defend life, not even just teachers, all staff, in a quiet, concealed way, I think that creates more of a deterrent, and we'll be able to cut down on some of these homicides and those mass shootings.
Rand, jump in here.
Yeah, so I have a few points. First, I think that we have to be careful when we're labeling shooters necessarily as weirdos. Generally, those shooters are kids that come from the school. And just like the brother said, teachers generally care about students. So now we're putting teachers in a position where they may have to shoot a student that they know. So that might be a conundrum for teachers who are, on the one hand, trying to defend the students that they have, but also not necessarily trying to throw away the life of a child who may have social, issues, social, emotional, mental issues. So we have to be very careful of putting teachers in that precarious position. That's the first point. Second point, I think with respect to the percentage of teachers who are white, again, that I bring that up as being important because there's also research from the APA that shows about how Black children are taken as older, how Black people are seen as, impervious to pain, where they don't feel as much pain. And so a lot of those accidental things that we may see, those things can come up because, of course, people may have preconceived racist ideas about our children. And the last point I want to make is just about our kids going to public schools and parents sending their kids to certain schools. I do agree. It is hard to talk from both sides of your mouth when you're saying one thing about a school, but then you're sending your kids there. But reality is that all parents don't have the option to take their kids out of public school or put their kids in a private school. If they do put their kids in a private school, somewhere where they may pay for, it's probably the same as a public school with the majority of teachers and administrators being white. Everybody doesn't have the option of putting their kids in homeschool because parents have to work. And even if there are a number of all Black administered, funded, and led schools, which are wonderful, and I think that all Black parents should strongly consider putting their kids in those schools, there aren't enough for all the Black people in this country to send their children. So I think it's important for Black people, with respect to sending their kids to schools, they should make an uproar. It may sound like they're being hypocritical, but if they don't have the option, and this is what they have to work with, I think it's important for them to make sure that as taxpayers, that their money is going to where those districts are, where those kids are going, that they have a say so and that they voice what they have to say about it.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I also think that those are two separate issues. I think that the conversation is, should teachers be armed in the worst case scenario? And I agree with all of those other different things. Everyone hasn't, my daughter, I have full custody. She's homeschooled, right? I don't have $10 million. And also we're seeing like Black people being the largest, newest growing demographic of homeschooled parents. So I'm not, those things I'm in agreement with. But the question here is, in scenarios, whether it's a child that a teacher has love for, that teacher also has a responsibility to protect. When you go on a field trip, she's there, that he or she, that instructor is there to make sure that all of the students are safe. So we're not putting the teacher in a precarious position in an extreme scenario where a student or ex-student comes back to try to take life. That student is. And what we're asking here is, should that teacher or janitor or any trained, safe and responsible firearm owner that meets a requirement for a school system, again, like in Ohio with Faster Saves Lives, should they have that option to defend life? And to me, the answer is unequivocally yes. Is it difficult? Anytime you have to use a firearm in a self-defensive situation, it's going to be difficult. That's the purpose of training. But to hamstring our parents, our students, and our teachers and say, you don't have the right to exercise a constitutionally protected human right because you happen to work here, especially when we know that there's some troubles in that space, which we can solve. And, we can look at the core of that, but to hamstring our teachers or facility in that way, the ones that actually want to train and want to be to defend if need be, I think that's a big thumbs down for me. It leaves our people victims.
I don't think we're hamstringing them by not letting them have guns. I think public policy folks and politicians are hamstringing our parents and our teachers and students from being safe. If we could get gun legislation in the country, if there was an actual desire to protect young people, I think that would do more to help folks out versus just giving them guns. I'm not necessarily against the argument of ownership. That's a completely different thing. But I think that with respect to putting our kids in school, I think that there are other measures that we can take. And quite honestly, we don't take those measures as a country. I won't say a nation because I don't believe that we're per se a nation. But as a country, I think that we don't take those measures because, again, we are not a racially homogenized nation. It's easy to point to those nations in the Western Hemisphere and Europe to say, oh, they do this, they do that. Yes, they're racially homogenized. But because we're protecting not just white folks, but all Black people, it's easier to say we're not going to do these policies. We're just going to let folks fend for themselves. And you know what? If having a gun is the way to go, then that's what you do. I think that there are many different ways to attack this issue. I think one of the more important ways that we do so is through voting, through policy changes, through encouraging folks to do the right thing, in addition to trying to find other ways to do so.
There's over 20.
Marcel Rand makes a point here when he says, normally these kids who are shooting up the school attend the school, which puts the teacher in a very precarious situation because perhaps it's a student that they have counseled. Perhaps it's a student that they know and are aware of that has issues. Let's face it, our teachers know the students sometimes more than the parents do, and on a very intimate level in terms of their thought process and emotionally. And so wouldn't this put the teacher, wouldn't this make us lose teachers? Because if I'm a teacher and I have to shoot a student that I know, do I really want to go back into that classroom and presume as if everything is normal again?
When there's any shooting, self-defense, there's going to be some trauma to the shooter. If you're a good person, you're not really wanting to take life. You don't want to commit violence on anyone. Now, of course, it's going to be hard if it's a former student. But the other side of that, and we see it time and time again in these shootings, where teachers are acting as bullet stops. They're standing in front of the doors, absorbing rounds so that those rounds don't go into our children. We have to put them in a better position where they're not just standing there sacrificing themselves as well. My wife is an educator. She's a teacher. My brother-in-law, my sister-in-law are both teachers. I know I can sit here and tell my wife every day, be safe, keep yourself safe. But if something happens, I know she's going to be first in line to put herself in harm's way to protect those children. I want to give her the best opportunity to protect herself and those children. And a firearm is the best way to eliminate that threat.
So
But
go ahead, Pastor.
I just think it's very dangerous for us to draw a conclusion that we have not seen the research, the data, or evidence actually make. Of course, we live in a country where there are over 300 million guns in the hands of, I think, about 350, 60, 70 million Americans. Guns are everywhere in this country. The precariousness of life and the vulnerability of life and being susceptible to a shooter, whether it's an interpersonal shooter or a mass shooter, is a daily reality, unfortunately, in this country. And yet the research and science from the CDC, from Harvard, from lots of different nonprofits, and even gun ownership groups alike agree on this one point, that the more presence that we have of guns in any environment, we actually have more tragedies related to accidental shootings and suicides, et cetera, than actual the defense of life. So all I want to suggest—
Pastor, we're going to come right back. We got to take a quick break on the business of being Black with. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack, and the business of being Black today is, are schools safer if we arm our teachers? Please welcome political activist and the founder of Black Guns Matter, Maj Toure, the director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives for Camden Promise Charter School, Rand Miller, the president of the Black Americans National Gun Club, Marcel Pope, and pastor and the director of the Live Free campaign, Pastor Mike McBride. Pastor, I want you to get your final thought in that you had before we went to break there, so go ahead.
Yeah, the point I was attempting to make around why public health approaches can be helpful is they can help us define the problem so we can create a proportional solution. Many mass shootings that relate to, the ones that make the news, the big kind of suburban or large white schools, are done by white males, young white males. But the mass shootings, quote unquote, mass shooting events that happen in urban schools are often related to group conflicts or interpersonal conflicts. There are public health strategies that myself, Erica Ford in New York, many others in our Black Grounds Gun Violence Prevention Consortium have successfully scaled up that actually reduce these kind of shootings through prevention and intervention without putting people at risk. And so I'm saying there are strategies we can use that can actually deal with the targeted expression of shootings in urban schools without responding to the kind of necessary but sometimes overblown focus on the mass shootings that happen in some of these more suburban contexts, still where some of our kids attend.
So should school districts be allowed to use federal funds for training or arming school personnel with guns? Where is your thought on that, Marcel?
That sounds excellent. It is a part of the school safety program. They pay to have resource officers in certain schools. Here in Florida, we do have the Guardianship Program where staff and teachers can become armed after going through a 6-week training, which, by the way, is more training than most armed guards get in Florida. There's a 48-hour armed guard course in Florida just to be an armed guard. These teachers and staff who take this course, their course far exceeds that. They're shooting up to 500 rounds a day. We didn't do that in the armed security class that I attended. It was very straightforward. We focused more on law. These guys are getting in-depth training. So, I agree. There are other ways that to keep our kids safe as well. But these things should work together. They shouldn't be considered separate entities. You should have the de-escalation skills. You should have these you see something, say something type things going on as well. But in a case where you are actively involved in these shootings, the escalation isn't going to help. These guys have made up their minds to cause violence. They come to kill people and usually put up high numbers. It has been proven that active shooters either surrender or kill themselves more than likely when they're presented with any type of pushback. They're not looking for soft targets. I mean, they are looking for soft targets. They're not looking for victims who fight back.
Maj, I see you in agreement here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we as a people are a holistic people, and I think we got to remember that. You know, we don't want to. I don't. You know, my daughter, she's 5, going on 6. She has a firearm. She has gas masks. She shoots. She also colors. She also deals with conflict resolution. We also sit down and we deal with this, you know, as a father should. My point in saying that is it is not a one-way approach. But when we're talking about last minute, a firearm is to defend life. Annually, that CDC data that the pastor brought up, there's 500,000 to 3 million defensive gun usages annually. That's a big jump. But anywhere between 500,000 to 3 million times a year, someone uses a firearm, most of them non-lethal, to deter someone from attacking someone else. So when we're talking about the extreme end of someone, student or not, right, coming into where our children are, obviously we want all of our staff to have all of the means to prevent that before it gets to that point. But at the same time, when it gets to that point, I don't want our people to not have the means to deal with that threat. Now, I also want them to have the healing, counseling, and dealing with that trauma if it ever came to that after or prior, you know, post the shooting as well. So this is a whole, like, you know, just like Marcel said, this is a holistic approach. It isn't, you know, one or the other in that view.
It is not one or the other in an ideal political context. But the history of Black people's experience in this country is that we never get funding for healing. We never get funding for non-lethal interventions in the worst conditions of Black people's lives. We always get funding that usually gets taken away from the education, the healing, the rehabilitation of our community members. And so right now with federal funding, literally being stripped away from many of our federal, state, and local funding being stripped away from schools, right? The idea that we would spend our tax dollars to train teachers who are supposed to teach our children, to train them not to be better teachers, not to deal with the inherent anti-Black racism and bias that many teachers, white teachers in particular, have towards our children. We're going to train these very same teachers to use a firearm in an active shooting environment that may sometimes involve Black children. To me, that feels like we are asking teachers to do what police have not been able to do themselves.
That's a feeling, but that feeling isn't backed up by the fact. The fact of the matter is that, again, the organization. It is not a feeling.
It is not a feeling.
The organization that I named is a nonprofit. You're not thinking out of the box, Pastor. You got to think a little bit more out of that box. We don't have to. Our organization, Black Guns Matter, has armed more African Americans in the last 4 years than any other time in world history. We do not take any federal funding. We are a nonprofit, and we do all of it voluntary, same as these other organizations that are named.
I was responding to the question about should federal dollars be used to train teachers. I rock with Black Guns Matter folk. I'm okay with Black gun ownership. I am against a profession, whether it's teachers or police, being armed to the teeth under the presumption that they're going to provide safety to our community.
So why call the police then? So why call the police?
I would rather not call the police for anything. I would rather just have our own security.
So if a mass shooter shows up.
Let me say this though, bro. Like, mass shooters in the mind of the public is very different than the kind of mass shooting events that happen in our schools with Black and brown family members. In the gun prevention space, a mass shooting is described as 6 or more people injured, right?
4 or more that are unrelated.
All right, that kind of shooting, at least in the cities that I work in, Oakland, New York, Chicago, those kind of shootings are not about some weirdo or blah blah blah. These are individuals in our communities who have conflicts outside the school, on the way to school. And so to me, The work we should be doing is intervening with the small number of individuals that we likely already know and ensuring that they do not continue to use lethal firearms to resolve conflicts. That is the work.
We're agreeing there. We're agreeing there on that. Again, like the brother said, it's a holistic approach to the scenario. We're agreeing there. But when you're talking about brass tacks, when you get to someone for whatever reason comes into a school for whatever their outside reason is, or whether they community or outside of the community, member of the school, ex-member of the school or not, I want the staff to have the means. If we've got broken down to the point where this person, where we haven't made them feel whole, where we haven't addressed some of those serious issues, we've had a failure. This person is now there to attempt to shoot people. I don't want to deal with that person like a social worker. I want to protect life. I want teachers to not, like Marcel said, I don't want them to have to use their bodies as shields to defend their life. I want them to have the means to stop that threat. We're talking about data. Over 90% of shooters in those scenarios, whether you want to call them mass or not, because they conveniently don't call none of the violence in inner city, they don't call that mass shooting. So I get your point, Pastor. What I'm saying is, in those spaces where those shooters are met with armed resistance, they either do one of two things. One, surrender, or two, stop themselves with that same firearm. My issue is when it gets to that point, I do not want our people that care for our children to not have the means, and the most effective mean is a firearm to stop that threat. Then we can address it as well as make sure it doesn't happen again. Absolutely. But in that moment, social work ain't going to help.
Rand?
Yeah, let me jump in. I was going to say, I don't think that the money.
Hold that thought. We'll come right back and get your thought, Rand. Please hold on to your thought. Write it down. We'll be right back on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack. Hello, everyone. The business of being Black today is, our schools safer when we arm our teachers? Rand?
Yeah, I was going to answer the question, should tax funding or be used for teacher trainings? I would say no. I'd like to see that money used to train teachers with respect to culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching.
Can't it be both? Can't it be used for both? Can't we walk and chew gum at the same time?
I would rather see that money go there first. Let's put it that way. If I can be technical, let that money go there first before we even start thinking about training teachers to be armed with guns. Because I think, for one thing, our teachers aren't culturally responsive. They're not using culturally relevance. We don't have enough texts that are reflective of our students. I'm talking about Black students in particular. We don't have teachers that are equipped to dealing with Black students. There have been research. I wrote a research study in 2017 talking about how white teachers tend to view our students in particular ways, thinking that certain behaviors elicit certain responses. So I think that that's important. And not just for that, but for schools where Black students aren't in the majority, where they may be in the minority. I think it's important that we do that kind of training as well, because again, as the pastor mentioned, many of these school shootings that we're referring to, the mass shootings, happen in suburban schools where white students are in the majority. White young males are the ones doing the shooting. I think that a lot of this teaching, a lot of the fear of talking about history, the fear of talking about critical race theory, for example, I think if we were to be truthful about history, truthful about the American experience for all people, we can begin to sort of myth shatter some of those things that are plaguing those school shooters who think that they are isolated, think that they are alone, think that they are other people of color trying to take their country, trying to take their opportunities. I think if we put some funding in those areas to help teachers, be preemptive in that way, be proactive in that way, I think that can go a long way.
So let me make sure I'm clear here, Rand. You're suggesting that if government funds were spent more on culturally educating our teachers, that these mass shootings wouldn't happen or would happen less?
No, I didn't say that they wouldn't happen. I'm saying that if you do that, you can preempt some of them from happening. Because again, if we're looking at who's doing the shooting, many of those mass shooters are white males, young white males, and some of them are coerced by some of these various white supremacist groups. Some of these folks are, reading some of these things that we find on social media that
a lot of this comes from home as well, we have to admit.
And they very well could do that. But again, we know that for for lack of a better word, teachers tend to be relied on, even in situations where kids have parents, where maybe parents aren't there, maybe parents aren't doing the best job that they possibly can. Maybe they are doing the best that they can, but they don't have the tools and the resources to do what it is that students may need. Teachers tend to be that resource. And so if we can help to equip teachers that way, I think that that could go a long way.
All of these things that I'm agreeing with that. Again, y'all, we not disagreeing. We're saying that there are things that this is a holistic approach. That's like this argument that, like, I hear this all of the time. Like, somehow gun owners don't care about children, don't care about how many people die, and it's just false. All of these are a holistic. For not to sound too rough, but I'm all with Pan-African, African-centered. My daughter is homeschooled. I get it. I'm talking about in that moment when there is a clear-cut breakdown. None of these things that we're talking about protects a person except for a safe and responsible trained firearm owner. When we're talking about that, or we're talking about any type of shooter of any background, over 90% when they are confronted with a hard potential target that they thought was a soft target, stops and either kills themselves or surrenders. You're talking about the Dylan Roofs of the world. I think you guys are also talking about the police officers, that energy where police officers are going to take Dylan Roof to Burger King after he murders a bunch of black people. And I'm agreeing with you that there's some conflict there, but we're talking about brass tacks. The gun is in the hand of someone that is not there to do happy, happy, joy, joy to our students. I want y'all, you guys still aren't saying why you don't want the teachers to have the means to defend our babies' lives.
No,
I don't want teachers.
I said,
go ahead, Doc.
I'm a fan of teachers having guns. They don't need to have guns. And I think you make the assumption that just because you do quote unquote training with teachers, that they're going to be prepared to make that judgment call.
That's what training is.
If you're in that situation, you can go through all the training in the world. We see police officers who are quote unquote trained, and we still see
police officers are the worst trained people in the world.
Does not matter. The point is that they're training. Who's to say that the training that the teachers are going to get is going to be competent?
The example that Marcel just gave is an example of it. If you go to only get 4 hours of instruction as opposed to someone that goes through 6 weeks of instruction, if you have Vault-Tec safes that are you got to use your fingerprints to open them. There's a protocol for everything. You guys are presenting a problem for every solution.
For any educator.
No. Let me ask this question. You make a good point, Maj. You make a good point. Hold that thought, Rand. Rand and Pastor Mike. I want to pose a direct question to you. Maj says, in that moment. Let's go to that moment. Let's say there's a school shooter that enters a classroom and begins to shoot, unload. In that moment, do you believe a teacher should have a gun, Pastor Mike?
No.
Rand?
No.
Y'all are crazy. Y'all are crazy.
But no, I'm not crazy.
Y'all are crazy. I love y'all, my brothers. This is spirited debate. But y'all are crazy. Have y'all ever been shot at?
Go ahead, Pastor.
Let me tell you why I'm not crazy. Because I've worked in classrooms with teachers, bro. And I'm telling you, you have this assumption about teachers that is not borne out in the reality of the American education system. The reality is teachers are disproportionately using force against Black children with suspension expulsions. Why is this important? You putting your head in your hand. Let me tell you why it's important. Why it's important. Because they are being trained right now not to do that to our kids, and they can't do that. They cannot act nonviolently. Large numbers of teachers cannot act nonviolent to our kids in nonviolent situations. And so I'm telling you that this idea that training alone, right, is going to, in a split second, cause a teacher to not accidentally shoot another child. They're going to have this laser focused aim to neutralize a target that is shooting at them. That is an unrealistic expectation. That does not even happen with the best civilian trained individuals.
You're wrong. You're saying things that are wrong, that are like just wrong. Pastor, you're saying things that are absolutely wrong.
Go ahead, Ray.
Your daughter is homeschooled.
Not because I don't want teachers to have arms.
It's homeschooled. So clearly you believe in homeschooling, as opposed to putting your kid in public school, which
Do you know why? Because most schools are gun-free zones. And I don't like that. I don't like that if somebody comes in where my precious daughter is and starts to pump out rounds, you guys are saying that my child doesn't have the right to have someone there to defend her life. No, so no, I just say no.
I'm saying a teacher comes in the moment. That
you make the assumption that the shooter is not going to see the teacher with the gun and shoot the teacher. And then what happens when the teacher gets shot?
You guys have not answered the question. You've danced around this question that Tammi Mack asked very simply. In that moment, if you guys listen, and again, I want everybody that's watching this, I want
the teacher to have the gun.
Right. I want the teacher to be an armed, safe, and responsible firearms owner that train, like we have organizations that are doing this type of training. Pastor Mike and Rand, do you guys train?
No.
Train with
firearms?
Yes.
Okay, so what type of training have you went through that you believe that your training means that you don't know about conflict resolution, de-escalation, sight alignment, sight picture, trigger control? What trainings have you went through that you've landed to the point that you don't even believe in the training that you take?
My training has had nothing to do with being in an education space. My training had to do with self-defense. And so I would not, as an educator.
That's not training.
Having been in a classroom, I can tell you I do not want to have a gun and have the responsibility of making that snap decision.
You don't. I do. The same reason why I carry a firearm. The same reason why I have a firearm right here.
Let's take a quick break and come right back on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. We'll be right back. It's getting a little too hot in here. Folk pulling out guns. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack. And the business of being Black today, are safer schools are safer. I have no idea what I'm saying. I'm losing my mind here. Are schools safer when teachers are armed? I got to say, Maj probably got me a little scared there. Please welcome political activist and the founder of Black Guns Matter, Maj Toure, the director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives for Camden Promise Charter School, Rand Miller, the president of the Black Americans National Gun Club, Marcel Pope, and pastor and the director of the Live Free campaign, Pastor Mike McBride. You all make very interesting points for both sides, and that's why I appreciate this conversation, because it's open dialogue that allows us to see both sides of the coin. And like many of you, most of you on the panel today have said, it should be a holistic approach and not just a one-sided approach. And I appreciate you all for putting in the input that exists that would help us get to that holistic approach. Marcel, I've got to know, what can you tell us about the Black Americans National Gun Club?
Well, our main goal is to make sure that those in our community are properly trained and responsible gun owners. We also promote first aid. So shooting and first aid goes hand in hand. We need to be able to treat our victims afterwards. A lot of people perish due to blood loss, and that's something that we can prevent as well. We want to get people trained on responsible gun ownership as well as first aid in our community.
That's interesting. I've never heard anyone include that in training. You say you want to be prepared to save the victim that is shot.
Not just the victim. We want to be able to say, anyone who's injured in that process. Again, the goal isn't to take life; it's to stop the threat. So, I mean, even if the shooter is down, after he's down and he's no longer a threat, I'll be more than happy to render aid to him as well. But I want to make sure that anybody who's injured, that we give them the best shot at survival after this.
Because for me, that puts a different perspective on it, because oftentimes when you think of shooting someone, you think of shooting them and leaving them for dead. But when you say, hey, we want to preserve the life as well, that's a whole different perspective when you talk about shooting a child in a situation where they come into a classroom to kill.
Tammi, I think that goes on the lines that the adrenaline, that doesn't account for the adrenaline of teachers in that particular moment. If they are trained or if they're not trained, if they do decide to make that decision to shoot and kill, who's to say that they're going to have the presence of mind to take one shot? Who's to say that shooter, after being shot, that they're going to stop in their tracks, that they're not going to continue to try and keep shooting? So I think that,
Well, we don't shoot until the threat is eliminated.
Yeah, but and if that's the case, who's to say that teacher won't be open to legal action from parents, from the district, from any other parent, right? And so it's a pretty, again, a precarious situation. Protecting teachers is just as much as the importance of not having a gun as it is protecting students.
Rand, tell us about your blog, The Urban Education Mixtape.
So the Urban Education Mixtape is just a blog to help urban educators, white teachers, teachers of color, working with students of color, particularly Black and Latinx students. I provide a number of tips, a number of different strategies that they can use to help in terms of working with those students and also improving in their professional practice.
What's one thing that you do that could help that?
In what you're talking about with respect to this topic, or just in general regarding?
In general, I love the podcast. So in general, what is it that what's one thing that you can do to help?
So what we do on the blog is we talk about things like the culturally responsive teaching, culturally relevant pedagogy, how to have difficult conversations. One of the things that we discuss also is for teachers that are working in an urban context, how do you have those conversations about history? How do you talk about the real history of the United States in light of everything going on with the critical race theory boogeyman that many of the politicians and parents are speaking about? So we help teachers have those discussions. We try to help with giving them information about the nuances of holidays and culture and things of that nature, how to incorporate truth and just a responsiveness to our students when they're teaching in general subjects.
Yeah. Maj, I want to ask you this real quick before we get into your Black Guns Matter. When we were talking, and what Rand mentions, he talks about teaching in an urban space. Look, the reality is that Black parents already have to deal with the pressures of teaching their children about police brutality. And so my thought is that when Pastor Mike and Rand talks about the differences in punishment, the difference in the way Black people are treated, or rather Black students are disproportionately treated, do you think that matters at all when you have a white teacher with a gun in the classroom?
Well, I think that matters to an extent bigger than whether there's a teacher in the classroom with a gun, a firearm or not. I think that what matters is what lesson plans and what culturally relevant or irrelevant information she's sharing with her students. And a lot of them, again, to Rand and Pastor's point, it's like, yo, you really believe that Christopher Columbus was the savior of things. And it's like, well, Ivan Van Sertima told me and showed us that that's actually not the case. So I think that part is a bigger chunk than whether she has a firearm. And again, if that parent or if that teacher has a firearm and there is a threat, if there's a threat, I'm not thinking about her bias. I'm thinking about his or her bias. I'm thinking about, can that teacher or person defend life? I think
Black
that's
Guns
a big
Matter. Tell me about it.
Black Guns Matter. We're a firearm training, conflict resolution, and de-escalation organization. We go to where there's most of the homicides around the country. We arm people on conflict resolution, de-escalation, and basic firearm training. We are completely crowd-funded. Everyone can donate if they want to. GoFundMe.com/Black Guns Matter. And all of the classes over the last 4 years, we gave away over $500,000 to do this work for free to make the classes available to everyone. And to Marcel's point, we also teach Stop the Bleed in the classes as well, because that's equally as vital.
Pastor Mike, what can you tell us about the Live Free Gun Violence Prevention Campaign?
Live Free is a national movement to reduce gun-related shootings and homicides in Black and Brown communities across the country. We target the less than 1% of the individuals in our cities that are driving about 60% of gun-related shootings and homicides with direct intervention, public health strategies, et cetera. We've had success in reducing gun violence by 25, 30, 40% in a dozen or so cities across the country up until COVID. COVID has saw a big spike. And so we believe in organizing, we believe in training, we believe in loving Black folks who are dealing with trauma back to life. And we do believe in responsible gun ownership. So I'm not opposed to the self-defense conversation. Black folks have a long legacy of self-defense with firearms, but mostly against the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists, not against our own people. So we ought to be clear about what exactly we talking about when we talk about self-defense up in here? Somebody say amen.
In one word, everyone, one word. I'd like to know, how can we keep our schools safe? In one word, Marcel.
Ooh, one word, that's hard. I don't know if I can do it in one word, but I'll say thinking outside of the box.
Pastor Mike.
Heal the hurt and the trauma of our people.
Rand.
That's tough. Truth in history.
Oh, okay. You sticking to that history.
I'm a
Maj.
history teacher.
Maj.
Training.
Well, thank you all for being on the show. The house is up next. And that's it for me and the business of being Black with Tammi Mack on Fox Soul. Until next time, everybody, it's a blessing to be in your box. Bye, y'all.